So today we're in the second part of looking at this non-institutional movement, is usually what it's called. A group of Christians within the Churches of Christ who became very concerned about a variety of institutions as they were developing within the church. Now, I want to make sure that we understand that this group wasn't against things like orphan homes, Christian colleges, mission work. They didn't have a problem with those things. The larger question was, can funding for those things come out of the church treasury? So they had no problem with individuals supporting orphan homes and colleges, right, with your own money. But the question was, could the church, as part of its budget, so to speak, send money to a college, send money to an orphan home, without there being a clear scriptural passage that said something like that? Certainly there were examples within the New Testament of churches collectively working together, taking funding to help the poor or the needy within the congregation. There were certainly other examples of individuals doing individual type benevolent things, but the congregation taking money that had been gathered for the Lord and using that for these institutions that aren't seen in Scripture, like a Christian college. Right? There wasn't any sort of concept of that in the first century. That became the bigger issue. And a lot of it has to do with this larger issue of scriptural silence. When Thomas Campbell writes in the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration and Address, when he writes there, where the Bible speaks, we speak, where the Bible is silent, we are silent. That seems like such a simple principle. It seems like such a common sense type of principle. But when you actually get into the nuts and bolts of having to determine, well, okay, what does that mean in the day-to-day life and operation of the church, it becomes a little bit more cloudy. It becomes a little bit more difficult to try and really try and address how that works out specifically. So we saw way back towards the beginning how the reformers divided over this issue, with Zwingli being the one that said if Scripture doesn't support it, authorize it, clearly state it, then it should be avoided. And Luther, on the other hand, saying as long as Scripture doesn't prohibit it, it's free to be done. Well, that same kind of tension develops within the Restoration movement in the 19th century, so that when we see the missionary societies, when we see a variety of the other things we looked at toward the end of the 19th century, the group that's becoming the separate disciples of Christ is taking the more Lutheran position on silence, and the Churches of Christ are taking the more Zwinglian principle on silence. And obviously what you have there are two foundationally different views on, if Scripture doesn't say something, what does that mean? And I think in one sense, and we'll probably try and touch on this in a couple of weeks as we get closer to the end, it's probably a little bit more complex than either one of those positions. Right? If it's not prohibited, it's okay, and if it's not authorized, don't do it. Well, silence is a little bit more complex, perhaps, than those simplistic type of positions. And so in the split between disciples of Christ and Churches of Christ, that's the big issue. But then the same kind of issue remains in the Churches of Christ, where you have the more what we call mainstream churches looking at things like Christian colleges and orphan homes and things like this, and some other things we'll talk about here in a little bit, and saying, well, they're expediencies. Right? God tells us to take care of orphans. God tells us to teach people everything that Christ has commanded. So these institutions are expediencies, are ways to carry out this command. And so, when Jesus says, go into all the world and preach the gospel, he doesn't exactly tell us how to do that. Can we use television? Can we use print media? Right? The point is going into all the world. But how we carry that out might be done in different ways. Well, on the other hand, the non-institutional group is saying, no, these are not expediencies. These are additions to Scripture. So you have, again, that foundational issue of scriptural silence and how silence functions. For example, and this doesn't appear to be an issue that develops within the churches of Christ too much, but we know that Christians are to sing. However, there isn't any mention in Scripture of songbooks. And so is a songbook an aid to singing, or is it something that should be avoided because it isn't positively commanded? And it's the same kind of principle here in addressing this issue of scriptural silence. When does silence mean absolutely not? And when does silence mean God is giving us some freedom to make some determinations? And so we looked Tuesday at a variety of ways in which this is coming up, and how you see this in the development of these non-Sunday school churches that will later break off into those that use multiple cups in communion, those that just use the one cup in communion, a variety of things related to colleges. And so the churches of Christ, which kind of developed as the more oppositional group, or oppositional part of the restoration movement towards institutions, began institutionalizing once that split, and even before the split takes place between the disciples and churches of Christ. And so there's this opposition and then acceptance of it. We talked about how that played itself out in the matter of colleges, and how opposition to colleges sometimes was a matter of, for example, people like Daniel Summer, who believe that the education of ministers is actually doing a disservice to the gospel. That people are going to these colleges, they're getting all this education, and it's leading them to look down on the people in their congregations who don't have that same type of education, who haven't had that luxury, so to speak. And so Summer was kind of opposed to that, but then there's also the question of that also developed, separate and apart from Summer, about whether a congregation can support a Christian college or not. With people like G.C. Brewer being out there vocally promoting the idea of congregations supporting colleges, and then on the other hand you have Foy Wallace Jr., who is actively opposing congregational support of colleges, just like he had when, in opposition to premillennialism. And predominantly for Wallace, certainly he is arguing from scriptural foundation, but it would not be surprising to think that part of his motivation and part of why he is so active in all of this is the way the Christian colleges have turned on him. And so that might also be playing in this as well. It's the opposition the colleges had toward Wallace, his positions, and his attitude and methods. We finished up talking about orphan homes, these efforts to try and provide both a residence and also schooling to orphans, particularly growing in the era after the Civil War due to the number of orphans that were, the increase in the number of orphans. With this question of here is this extra congregational type of institution that in some people's eyes, might be supplanting the church's responsibility to take care of orphans in their midst and kind of putting it off on a separate organization. Which is another part of this is that lingering notion of the local congregation as being the institution that God works through. So that for a lot of the non-institutional Christians, the idea is that God has established the local congregation. Now, yes, there is in Scripture this notion of the universal church and all of the congregations and all the churches of all the entire world. But the focus for a lot of non-institutional individuals was that the local congregation, and that if you did any sort of organization, like an orphan home, like college, that is this extra congregational type of thing, where it's not under the oversight of elders, it's not specifically the ministry of an individual church, that you are supplanting and subverting the efforts of the local congregation. And so the non-institutional group is tending to emphasize the locality of the church, while others, the more institutional brethren, are emphasizing the more universal nature of the church. And that each congregation is part of a larger universal church. Now, both groups would be opposed to the notion of trying to create another denomination. They're still holding on to that idea of the Restoration movement about being this anti-denominational type of organism. And so both would kind of use the terms that would reject denominationalism, but often the non-institutional wing of the Churches of Christ would look at these institutions and claim that the mainstream group was becoming a denomination. That they were becoming something distinct, much like the disciples of Christ had done. Where the mainstream group was looking at the non-institutional group as you're trying to develop a different sect. Now, sect and denomination are terms that get thrown around a lot throughout the 19th century and 20th century, sometimes used indiscriminately, sometimes used in Churches of Christ, so that when you read Alexander Campbell, when you read Foy Wallace, when you read some of these people in the Restoration movement, sect and denomination are interchangeable. But essentially, from a sociological standpoint, a sect would be a small group, usually a splinter group, starts off as a splinter group, that has very hard and fast boundaries between the in-group and the out-group. Right? There's a clear boundary between who's in and who's out. And who's in is usually the true remnant, the faithful group, in this case of Christianity. Right? But we could talk about the same type of phenomenon in other types of religions. So the sect often sees it as we are upholding the truth. And even though other people outside might be calling themselves Christians, they are not living faithfully. Right? So they're either errant Christians, or depending on the sect, it might be that they're not even Christians. They think they're Christians, but they're not Christians. So that's what sociologically a sect works as. Denomination, though, tends to be a group that sees itself as a part of, or one type of, a larger type of movement. And so there would be kind of like, in a denominational mindset, let's say there's Christianity, but then within that there's Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, Episcopalians, all sorts of different groups. And often there is that mindset of, while we might know better, we're still kind of recognizing these other groups as Christians. Right? So, that it's not a total idea of getting rid of the name or the identity of that particular group, but it's one group among many that are in a larger umbrella, where the sect would say, it's just us.